Hi, we're going to make a leather holster for a Ruger SR22. So once we get the pattern printed, verify that the scale is correct. Take a look and make sure we got everything we need. We'll go ahead and just roughly cut out the pattern. Leave yourself a little bit of room. I just use a knife for this and then trim it up with the scissors. So once you get that done, we'll grab some leather and get going. I just rough cut again some pieces of leather. I like to just take regular Scotch tape and masking tape. Any tape will work. But go ahead and tape the pattern down to the leather. I kind of clean the edges up a little bit. Still not cutting to the pattern line, but just kind of get a little closer, a little nicer. We'll go ahead and grab some lining. I like to line these holsters. This is just some pig suede lining. For this one we're using chocolate brown. I just cut it out. Give it a little room, a little extra room. Once we get that done, we'll just glue it up. I grab a piece of paper or something to keep the glue off my cutting mat, and we'll go ahead and just cover it really well, both pieces, with contact cement. I get it fairly close to the edges, but since we've overcut our leather and overcut our lining, there's no need to be too particular about how we get it to, how close we get to the edge. Just give it a nice coat, nice even coat on all four pieces. Once we let it dry, take a few minutes. Go ahead and put your pattern onto the backing, and I just have a little speedball roller that I use to roll it down. It sticks really well. I usually give this a little time to dry. Once we get it stuck down, I'll take it to the anvil and kind of hammer it down a little bit just to get a good adhesion. Here we got both of our pieces of the holster with the lining attached. And I trim up the lining. I use an X-Acto knife. Any knife will work. Now we'll go ahead and take a look at it, and we'll punch the holes. The top and bottom pieces there that I'm showing you on each side of the holsters, the stitching will be just for the lining part of it. But we'll go ahead and punch all the holes at this point. I'm using a 1mm punch. Get it all punched. Now that all the holes are punched, we'll go ahead and just trim it. You can use a straight edge or however you like. I just grab it, and on these pieces I'll use an X-Acto knife or kind of whatever knife I have handy, as long as it's sharp. You just go ahead and cut out right on the line. And if you notice, I also punched on the front piece of the holster. I punched out the belt slots. I didn't do that on the back. I don't until later on once they're glued together. I'll just punch the front. We got them all cut out, and go ahead and sew. At this point, the front and the back are still separate, so I'll just sew along the top and bottom, just where the lining, to keep the lining a little more stable and make sure it never comes out. If you notice at this point too, I've already dyed the leather. So go ahead and dye it however you want, whatever color. Same way with the thread. I'm using white in this case, but of course, use any. It's a 1mm waxed thread. So I'll get the top and bottom of the front and back sewn, just like I said, where the lining is, not where the two pieces come together. I have a pair of mechanics gloves I like to use. I cut the thumb and the finger out, but I can really tighten the thread down without gouging into my hand. Spend a couple hours sewing in a day and your hands get pretty torn up. So now that we got that, you can see where the two are sewn just for the lining's sake, and we'll go ahead and glue up. I glue one side at a time. Sometimes I just use the little brush, so it's a little bit easier on these smaller holsters. Just get a good coat of glue on one side. You can really start on either side. I don't find that there's any difference. But one of those little acid brushes give you a little bit better, a little more control on these smaller holsters. Since you've already punched your holes, you can see exactly where you need to glue. So we'll glue it up and let it sit for just a few minutes. Now we let her sit, and I got a bunch of these little scratch-alls. I got them on Amazon. They're really inexpensive. I just got a whole bunch of them. It helps line up the holes. Since we've pre-punched the holes and we're doing it all by hand, there could be a little bit of a tolerance on the hole locations, but if you follow the pattern, you're pretty good. So I just use a bunch of those awls to make sure everything's nice and lined up and get it all glued down. I usually tap it with a hammer a little bit and make sure it's stuck, and I'll leave it sit for a few minutes. I don't know that you need to let it sit all that long. That's contact cement is pretty good stuff. We'll go on to the next side. This side I wet the top of the leather, the front piece, just to make it a little bit more movable, because the top piece is a little bit bigger than the bottom, so we don't get such a tight fit on the gun. So we'll go ahead and glue that up just like we did on the first side. Again, using that same little acid brush and contact cement. I just put one coat on. I've heard people talk that you need to double coat this. I've never had any problems with just one coat. I don't know. It seems to be working just fine. I've never had any issues, like I said. So I just give it one good coat and give it a few minutes to dry. Once we let that dry, go ahead and, like I said, I always wet the top piece of leather inside and out if you can. It's a little bit easier when you don't use the lining, but I really like the lining in these. Kind of smush it around and get it used to the shape again using those same awls. We'll go ahead and this one you really need them, I think, to really keep things lined up. So I just grab a bunch of them and make sure everything's lined up. You just gotta be a little bit careful once those two pieces of leather with the glue come together. They're pretty hard to get apart. So go ahead and just give everything a good squeeze and make sure everything's fitting good and all the holes are lining up. And go ahead and I just pull the awls out and tap it with a hammer a little bit and let it dry. Once you get it to dry, since you did hand cut and punch all these holes, sometimes there's a little bit misalignment on these edges, so I just take a Dremel with some sandpaper and kind of clean up the edges and make everything look really good. Go ahead at this point, I use the edger and just take a little off the edges. Once I kind of get the edges sanded even. Everything's looking pretty good at this point now. Go ahead. You see that I punched the rest of the hole all the way through for both of the belt loops at this point, and then I just soak it in some water for a little bit. Again, I've heard so many things. People say soap water and hot water and cold water, and it's got to soak for 5 minutes. I don't know. I haven't found any difference. I just put it in a little water. You can kind of feel when it gets wet and loosens up, and I think that's just fine. It's not that complicated. Just get it wet, and you can feel when the leather softens up. And we go ahead and just mold it. I have a gun mold. It's a blue gun, it's called. Plastic mold of the SR22. Go ahead and just kind of use a slicker or whatever I got handy and kind of make sure everything's molded in there and make sure everything's fits well. And that's about it. I just let it dry overnight. Kind of keep an eye on it. I like to futz with it a little bit, but there you go. Thanks for watching.